See you, Mark. How are things? Good to see you. Hey, how are you? Nice to see you, Mark. Good to see you. Hey, nice to see you. How are you?
Glad you could be with us.
Yeah, absolutely. This is where you want me here?
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for taking the time to come by.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much for having us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. And you're at J. Clark right now?
Yeah, I go to J. Clark Richardson. I'm grade 12 senior year last year.
Okay. So is this is independent from school, or is this?
Yeah, it's independent from school. I started this in the summer of 2019 to encourage youth in politics. I needed a way to make people in my grade and in high school to learn about the issues that we're facing in the world, right?
Sure.
And I did it by a podcast, because if I'm in a podcast, I feel like my friends would listen to it and they would tell their friends to listen. Oh, I know this guy that's in a podcast.
Well, you got evidence. You definitely got lots of folks listening.
These guys, they didn't like it when I started the podcast. They were like, oh, it's a bad podcast, not gonna do anything, right? And now they love it.
Awesome.
They're part of the team now.
Good stuff. Good stuff.
Yeah.
Well, happy to talk, and thanks for taking the time.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to start the intro.
All right, let's start.
All right, so welcome back to another episode of the World Today podcast. In today's episode, we have MP Mark Holland, who is an MP and representing the riding of Ajax, and also the Chief Government Whip. So I prepared a bunch of questions for Mr. Holland today, and the first question I want to start off is basically, we have viewers from all over the world, and not everybody knows who Mr. Holland is. So Mr. Holland, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Sure. So I've been the Member of Parliament for the riding of Ajax since the year 2004. I took an involuntary leave in 2011 where I lost when I did a bunch of things for the Heart and Stroke Foundation. I was their executive director. Prior to that, I was in municipal politics. I was a local and regional councillor here in Durham, and had been involved with a bunch of organizations from RBC Dominion Securities to CIBC, but always lived here. This is my hometown, Ajax. I went to school at Pickering High and went to Westney Heights Public School. So this has always been my hometown.
Yeah. So a lot of people don't know what a chief government whip is, right? What is the responsibility of a chief government whip? What are they? What is that role? What is that job?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of people don't know what the whip does. Most of my work is behind the scenes. And I have a bunch of different responsibilities. The biggest responsibility that I have is to bring members of parliament together on issues. So to be an interlocutor between cabinet and caucus. And what does that mean? Well, you can imagine when a government wants to introduce a bill or to get something passed, that it has to get the support of the House of Commons to do so. So it's my job to try to convince my colleagues, other elected MPs, to vote for something, but also to try to convince cabinet more often than not that they've got to change something because MPs don't like something in it. In a minority government, this is even more complex. I was a whip in a majority government. Now I'm a whip in a minority government because you have to work with other parties. So the first responsibility I have is to win votes. And I traditionally it's called whipping votes because there's discipline involved. But I really very rarely use discipline. I try to get people to be on the same page, bring people together, find compromise and middle ground. And that's the vast majority of how I try to get to that. The second function that we play is an HR function. So you can imagine we have within our caucus over 150 members. And every single one of those MPs has about 5 or 6 staff. And we also have cabinet ministers who have staff. So we're responsible for all of the human resources related issues. If people are having problems in work or stress, then we're responsible for that. I'm responsible for the morale of our team, to try to keep morale up, to work with other caucus members to understand what challenges they're facing. And then I'm responsible for a lot of, very technical, tactical aspects. For example, allocation of offices, who sits on what committees, working to help figure out who's going to be the chair of committees, responsible for making sure that people are in the House, that we have enough people voting on a given measure. So there's a lot of different elements to being whip.
Yeah, so also there's challenges that you face for every job position. So what is the most challenging part of being a whip?
Well, I mean, very practically, the hardest part of this job is being away. I love my work and I love my job. I love trying to build a strong team and to work on issues that I'm passionate about. But sleeping, 4 or 5 nights a week away from home is very challenging. So I think being away from the people that you love is the hardest part of the job. The rest of it is, really comes down to how poisonous our dialogue is. I enjoy a vigorous debate. I enjoy somebody who disagrees with me having a conversation and sort of sharing our views. But I don't enjoy how toxic a lot of that debate is becoming. And so the sort of the nastier side of politics can be very unpleasant. And I not only have to deal with it myself, obviously I have to help my members who are dealing with it as they try to do their work as well.
Yeah. So my next question to you is, how has a recent world event influenced your perspective on life?
Well, I think we're living through a very challenging time. Remember that, for your generation, you are entering a world where the pace of change is faster than it has ever been in human history. That for most of human history, people's lives, there'd be very little that would change over the course of one generation to the next. I had a lunch today with a couple in their 70s, and the amount of change that they've had to adapt to is absolutely massive. And so we can look at somebody who may have worked in the coal mines, as an example, down in the United States in the Rust Belt, where multi-generationally they knew that they were going to work in the coal mines, and just as their parents and their grandparents had. Now not only are they those jobs being displaced, but the jobs that are coming in are based on technologies that never even existed before. They had only dealt with really their own culture, and now they're dealing with every culture. They had never met somebody perhaps from the LGBTQ community, or maybe if they had, they didn't know it. So the world is changing very rapidly around it, and I think it's very scary for people. And so the biggest impact of recent time is I think that people dealing with that rapidity of change, how much change is occurring, is very scary for them. And we get very large reactions on the extremes, both the extreme right and the extreme left, sort of responding to that but with very simple, overly simplistic solutions that I think is very challenging. The other piece that I think is really challenging is the quality of our discourse. Unfortunately, as good as technology is and how much it's improved our lives, I don't think it's improved how we talk to one another. And you have a perfect storm of fear on the one hand because there's so much change going on, and on the other hand, an oversimplification of the means and through which we communicate, where people are either communicating through pictures, a perfect version that's not honest of themselves or their life as they curate it, or in a very small number of words sharing an opinion that isn't very detailed. And because of the anonymity, it can be very nasty. So I think we've seen a deterioration of our discourse, and I think that's a big challenge for our time. And I commend you for doing this, because I think the biggest thing that we have to do to get beyond the simple platitudes of talking points, talking to one another, is have deeper, more meaningful conversations about the issues that we're facing.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. My next question is affordable housing. House prices are getting super high. I mean, when I get older and if I want to buy a house, a small house might cost me $1 million, which my parents probably bought for like $800,000, $500,000. So what is the government trying to do, the federal government trying to do, to make affordable housing better and just make people afford houses?
Sure. Well, we talk about change. Our region has seen an enormous amount of change. The very first home that I bought out here, and I'm not that old, I'm 45, I bought for $94,000. You couldn't buy a parking space for $94,000 today. So we're seeing the Greater Toronto Area become one of the great mega cities of the world. And so that's associated with all kinds of wonderful things in terms of cultural vibrancy, in terms of economic opportunity. It's an absolutely phenomenal place to live, and people are recognizing that. They want to move here. And so the principal question that is on our mind is because the federal government had exited housing, and now we've come in with an incredibly ambitious national housing strategy with $11 billion over the next 10 years behind it, to make sure that everybody has a place to live, and that is not that's well integrated into all neighborhoods. I don't think that our communities are well served by having everybody in a particular neighborhood make approximately the same amount of money and have the same background. I think we're much more successful when there's integration into neighborhoods. So we need to work with all levels of government. Housing is a very complex issue. We can come to the table with money and projects federally, but we have to work with our municipal and provincial partners on how that's integrated into the community with a real focus on affordability. Because the reality is, if you want to live in downtown Toronto and have a single detached home, unless you have a huge abundance of money, that is probably not a realistic expectation any more than it would be to say I want to live in downtown Manhattan and have a single detached home. There's a Manhattanization that is occurring to Toronto, and so we have to shift our expectations. If the desire is ownership, then we have to take a look at what's a reasonable expectation for somebody to be able to afford that. But the principal focus is to make sure that everybody does have a home they can afford. We have people who are working incredibly hard, and housing represents 50-60% of their budget. That's totally unacceptable, and we have to make sure that there are alternatives for people across the income spectrum to have housing that is affordable so that it doesn't choke out the other needs in their life.
For sure. This actually leads to my next question, where every house has a water system, running system, but some communities in Canada, especially the Indigenous communities, don't have clean drinking water. We learned that in my Indigenous class in grade 12. Mr. Lizette, who is our teacher, he taught us, because I never knew about this issue that existed, and he told us that there's no clean drinking water in the communities, in the Indigenous communities. And in the 1970s, the Canadian government promised to bring clean drinking water to all communities in Canada. And now, 2020, 100% of cities have clean drinking water, 99% of rural areas have clean drinking water. That 1% which is missing is the Indigenous communities. So what is the Liberal government trying to do to fix this issue?
Well, it's totally unacceptable that any community should have unsafe drinking water. That is not an acceptable circumstance, and it's been a collective failures of successive governments that this issue took so long to be addressed. But I'm profoundly proud of the progress that we've been making over the last 5 years. Or 4.5. We've lifted almost all of the boiled water advisories in First Nations communities, and we're well on track in the immediate future to completely eliminating boiled water advisories and unsafe drinking water conditions in all First Nations reserves across the country. It's an absolutely critical step, and we've made huge investments over the last while to get to this point, and I'm very proud to say that we're on the precipice of having that done. But the reality is, it doesn't mean that the issues that are facing First Nations communities are fixed. When I was with the Heart and Stroke Foundation, one of the roles that I had was the National Director of Children and Youth. And when we're talking about, and we had a number of programs that were dealing with First Nations youth, and the myriad of issues that are facing First Nations people, and particularly First Nations youth, we have to understand their genesis. They have their genesis in programs like the residential school program and the abject failure of successive governments of different political stripes to address issues that have faced the First Nations community, such that the level of complexity in those communities is infinitely greater than it should be, and it's going to require really sustained effort. And I think we've made tremendous progress not only on drinking water but on all issues as it deals with reconciliation and working with First Nations people. But we need that to be a continued and sustained effort over successive governments to get that job done, which means we need strong political will from you and others, as well as action obviously expected from your elected officials.
Yes. My next question is, we saw something very different this year, 2019 elections, where there are no Liberal MPs in Saskatchewan and Alberta. I mean, it was really confusing. Why do you think this happened? And what can we do to fix it?
I'm tremendously sympathetic to the challenges that are being faced right now in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And, while we deal with the menace of global climate change, we have to understand that the economies in Alberta and Saskatchewan have been heavily dependent upon carbon-based forms of fuel, and the demand for those types of fuel are in decline as the world moves to more sustainable, renewable energies. And so, there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of people experiencing a very difficult circumstance. And there are some people peddling the idea that there's a simple solution, that all you have to do is snap your fingers and these problems will go away. And there's a seduction to that. But it's dishonest. And the reality is that that relying solely on oil and gas to fuel the Canadian economy is not a realistic strategy. It's not a realistic strategy for Alberta and Saskatchewan. It's certainly not for the Canadian economy most broadly. So we need to work, and that doesn't mean it's not going to continue to be an important part of our economy. It absolutely will, but it's going to be a declining. Economy over time, just because of the trajectory of how energy is going to be used and how it has to be used in order to meet our obligations under climate change. That means that our economy is under a period of enormous transition. I look at Ontario and the challenges that we still are facing as we transition out of traditional forms of manufacturing. And that has been a very difficult challenge, but one that we, after a difficult period, have been successful to migrate to. And I think it does Alberta and Saskatchewan a tremendous disservice not to talk about the incredible talent, ability, and industries that exist outside of oil and gas. And so we need to, as that change is occurring, to work with those provinces and to fight against the temptation for simplistic solutions. I think it's irksome when politicians say, "Oh well, we can just go back to the way it was. We can just run our economy off of oil and gas, and everything's fine here." You don't need to listen to people talking about climate change. Climate change isn't real, and people are going to continue to use oil and gas as much as they did before. That's not being truthful with people. And so sometimes having hard conversations is a difficult path. But conversely, we can't be moralistic and stand and say, "Oh well, Alberta and Saskatchewan, you got to shut it all down and move on. Times have changed," and have no sympathy, because the reality is we still use oil and gas. It's still a very important part of our economy. It's still a very important part of each and every one of our lives. It ran, I don't know how you got here today, but however you got here, chances are it involved oil and gas. Yeah. So, we have to recognize that we all have responsibility for this transition. And that we all have to share in the pain of what's going on to help find those solutions. And I think it has to be broached with preeminent sympathy. I don't think it would be helpful for the country to behave in any different way.
Yeah, for sure. Right now, it's all over the news, COVID-19. So what is the Liberal government trying to do to stop this disease from spreading, this virus from spreading in Canada?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is take a step back. There's no doubt when I lived through SARS and how scary that was for folks, and now seeing the coronavirus and people's fears around that. But we always have to contextualize fear. So the first thing that I would say is you take reasonable precautions without moving into a territory that's unnecessary. Reasonable precautions are avoid touching your face whenever possible, washing your hands for longer than 20 seconds with soap and water frequently throughout the day, particularly after you've been in places where you're touching things. But the risk in Canada is relatively very low at this time. And I think people should wait to take direction on the next steps as they come. We have absolutely incredible officials that work within our health department, both nationally but also provincially and municipally. And I think that when people try to take matters into their own hands, and I hear people spending all kinds of money buying masks that aren't going to do anything for them, or wearing surgical gloves all the time, or making major decisions around their travel that aren't based in fact. I mean, certainly if you're looking to travel, you should check out travel advisories and look for government opinion. But we're very fortunate to live in a country where you can trust the information that's coming from your government, and you can trust the actions taken by your government working in coordination with the World Health Organization. But, we have to remember as we deal with this that there is a certain risk that comes from being human. There's a risk when you're on the road of an automobile accident. There's a risk in living your life of cardiovascular disease or cancer or diabetes. And we try to mitigate these risks. But it's part of being human. And if we go too far in our fear of any one of them, it's dislodged, I think, from reality. And so I do worry that people are going to get ahead of themselves and panic about this in a way that isn't contextualized against the other risks that exist in life. And right now, when you go to bed and you fall asleep at night, of all the things that you could worry to take your life, it's not helpful to fixate on this. It's helpful to focus on what is reasonable precautions you can take, just as you have reasonable precautions you take against being in a car accident or getting heart disease.
For sure. Before I get to my last question, I have a friend from England who came here this year to study in Canada, and he had a question. He's really interested in politics, and he had a question about what can youths do to get involved in politics. So I'm going to call him here.
Sure, come on in. Welcome from the United Kingdom.
Nice to meet you.
Good to see you. How are you?
Fine, thank you. The question that I'm going to ask, as I'm deeply interested in politics, when I go home, I would like to be a Minister of Parliament. As a youth who's interested and envisions a career in politics, what would be the ideal way or route to get into this profession?
I think the first thing that any involvement in politics has to be centered on is, what are your passions? What are the reasons why you want to be involved in politics? And to understand those really thoroughly. And you don't necessarily have to understand them day one of going and volunteering. But I think before you run, you need to explore that. A lot of people are attracted to politics because they want to be involved in decision making. But I think when you have people who go and say, yes, I want to be involved in decision making, but I have a really clear passion for the things I want to change and why I want to be there and what I want to try to do when I'm there. Because at the end of the day, politics is a fickle business. And you have to look at it more as an opportunity than as a job. And I have no doubt that you'll be successful in becoming a member of parliament. A minister is a whole other kettle of fish. We can have a longer conversation about that. But it's going in with a clear idea of what you want to accomplish. Because a lot of times, I meet people who want to go into politics and want to be involved in change, and then they get there and they're frustrated because then they're focused on becoming a minister or becoming something else, instead of looking at the incredible opportunity that exists within the political process at every level to affect change. Unfortunately, so few people get involved in politics that it means that anybody who does get involved and has passion can make a huge difference. I was somebody who had no connections, didn't know anybody. My parents voted, but that was about it. And I really loved politics, and I wanted to get involved. And and so I started volunteering. And as I volunteered, I found things that I was passionate about and really cared about. And I found people who shared that, shared the causes that I cared about, and had the opportunity to affect change. And sometimes I was so much in a hurry to get where I was trying to go, becoming an MP, becoming a minister, becoming whatever it might be, that you lose sight of the opportunity you have in that individual moment to affect change. And so the number one thing that I would say, because people will be enormously attracted to it, is if when you get involved, you focus on what's in front of you. If you are going to go and get involved, it's totally good to have ambition and want to become something, but don't miss the opportunity that's in front of you to affect change and to make a difference where you are. So if you walk in the door and say, I want to volunteer in politics, because you find somebody who shares your values and sees a world, or sees a country in your case, that you want the country to be or the world to be, don't miss that opportunity in that moment as a volunteer, as somebody who's doing something like knocking on doors or making telephone calls, to realize how important that is. So many elections have turned on just a small number of conversations, and those elections can have huge ramifications to the type of world that we live in. So get involved, find people that share your values, find people that you believe in and that you want to mentor you, inhabit the moment that you're in honestly, and to try to actually make as big a change as you can when you're there, and be appreciative of any opportunity you have to be involved in a democratic process. And I'll end on that point. When I have the opportunity to knock with people who come from countries that don't have democracies, who can't even go out and share their opinion, who knocking on a door is an insane privilege to them, to be able to say what is in their heart, what they feel should change and what should happen for the world. That's an enormous privilege. That's an enormous responsibility. And I don't think we do it justice. A lot of times we're in such a hurry to get to the next beat that we don't recognize the moment that we're in is spectacular, and that we can affect a lot of change in it. So, I have no doubt you're here, you're talking about politics, you're interested, you're already taking that huge step. The next step is to get involved, find people you believe in, support them, find causes you care about, support them. And if you treat those moments honestly, if you come to them and try to make the best difference you can in each of those moments, getting involved, then the rest will come as a matter of natural course. You'll find that people will say, hey, you know what, you did a really good job with that. You should step up and have more responsibility. And that additional responsibility at first may be in the form of a job in politics, or maybe in the form of running, or whatever form it may take. You have to let it unfold. If you get too fixated on the finish line, then you forget to run the race.
Oh, thanks, Ahsan.
No problem.
Well, thank you so much for answering this question. So my last question, I want to end on this note.
Sure.
What is it like working with the Prime Minister, the big man himself?
Well, the first thing you learn is that the big man himself is like anybody else. I think that on a really personal note, he's just a great guy who I have a tremendous regard for as a person, as a father, as a friend, as a fellow colleague. And I appreciate that he's very down to earth. He's somebody I can have real conversations with about silly things as well as very serious things. And I think, it's a tough job. I think that we don't have enough respect. I may completely disagree with the policies of conservative governments, and I'm certainly no fan of Stephen Harper, but I have profound respect for the office and the sacrifices of it. And I don't think anybody has a full understanding of just the depth of sacrifice it takes to be a prime minister, to have your life constantly under scrutiny and constantly be questioned and constantly be written about. I have tremendous respect for people who will stand up and endure that kind of scrutiny and that kind of life in the name of public service. And I think all of our politics would be much more civil if we started from that place of mutual respect, even if we disagree with issues.
For sure, we need to understand the differences amongst us.
As well as the similarities. I mean, at the end of the day, I may disagree vociferously with the Conservatives on any given issue, but I don't doubt that they come to the table thinking that they're trying to do the best thing for the country, even if I disagree with their conclusion. And I think all of our conversations should be centered in that, and it's too often not. Too often we question somebody else's motives. They're trying to destroy the country, or they're trying to rip apart, some sacred institution that we all care about. Every person that I've met, with some exceptions, but certainly as a general rule, regardless of political stripe, they're there because they're trying to do the right thing. They're trying to make a difference. And they may be, in my opinion, misguided in their perspective, but I respect the fact that they're standing up and fighting for their values. And they're willing to endure this incredible journey of standing up and speaking out for your values. Because in today's world, if you stand up and say that you stand for something, then you have to be absolutely assaulted in every angle. And whether or not that's left or that's right, it is wrong. It is toxic. I don't know how to fix it, but it's a massive problem in our discourse.
For sure. Mr. Han, I thank you so much for being on my podcast. We all love it when you're here with us. We thank you so much for being on our podcast, and I hope you have a great day.
Absolutely. I hope you have a great day too. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you.